All right, everyone. Welcome to the panel on statistics and computation. I'm Ankur Moitra. I'm the director for SDSC, and I'll be moderating today's panel. So I just wanted to say a few brief words before we hear from these eminent speakers. So when I came to SDSC, I started off in the math department, and there was really just some corners of statistics that really grabbed my interest because they were really related to my research. And in the years that I've spent in being involved in SDSC, it always amazes me the extent to which the perspectives from statistics have connections and have implications and inroads in other disciplines. So I'm really excited that we have an awesome lineup of speakers who get to tell you about some highlights over the years and ways that statistical perspectives have influenced other disciplines and vice versa. So we'll start off, each one of them will give a 10-minute talk. We won't have any questions afterwards, but we'll wait until everyone's done, and then I have a few questions to start off. We'll take questions from the audience, and I'm hoping for a very lively discussion. So if you guys don't ask any controversial questions, I have some ready, and they're all aimed at Philippe. So if you don't want to hear them, come up with some good questions. Let's start off with Alberto, so please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Alberto Abadie. I am professor of economics here at MIT and also associate director of IDSS. And I come here today to tell you a story about what happens when people from different disciplines come together in a place like IDSS and learn from each other and the synergies and impact that these collaborations can produce. Okay, and the title of my, short presentation is Synthetic Learning by Humans, and it's not artificial, it's by humans. And it is, of course, because it's going to be related to synthetic controls, but also it's going to be related to, how much we can learn by putting together pieces of knowledge that we collect across different disciplines. Oh, I have to point here, I was told. Okay, perhaps I can use this. There you go. So I'm going to talk about causal inference, and causal inference is hard, and it's hard because it requires estimation of counterfactual outcome. Here I have an example. We may be interested in evaluating the effects of a large-scale tobacco control program in California. The name was Proposition 99. We know what happens in California in terms of tobacco consumption with interventions. We would like to know what would have happened without intervention to make this evaluation. Ideally, we will have a state that is exactly like California in terms of predictors of a future consumption of tobacco, and but this state is not affected by the intervention of interest. So, to looking at this outcome, we could reproduce, the counterfactual outcome that we will have observed in California in the absence of the intervention. However, when you go to the data, very rapidly you will find out that there is no state that is like that, and then what can you do? And synthetic controls is based on the idea that perhaps we can put together combinations of states to match the characteristics that California had before the intervention, as I said before, in terms of predictors of tobacco consumption. Okay, so this is how it is done kind of in practice. Like this is an example. Here we have the trajectory of tobacco consumption in California before and after the passage of Proposition 99, and also in the rest of the US. And as you can see, the rest of the US is not a good comparison and not a good control for California. It's having a very different trajectory, even in before the passage of this this intervention, Proposition 99. So what we are going to try to do, I went too fast. What we are going to try to do is to get, a combination of other states to match the characteristics of California. And as you can see here, we are doing this very well in terms of the trajectory of tobacco consumption before the intervention, but we also, it's not shown here, but we do the same with other characteristics, other predictors of future tobacco consumption. And again, this is a combination of other states in the United States that are not under this intervention. So some years ago, I'm working on this type of method. They become quite popular in in the social sciences, but then, like I come to MIT and I start talking to some people in computer science. And, like I talk to many people, like I want to mention Deborah, who is here, like I am, telling him about this type of research, and what he sees in his mind, in fact, is a matrix. And say, like, okay, so what you're telling me is that we have a matrix, like we have here, these are the states, these are the years, and for every state and every year, like you observe, tobacco consumption without intervention, except for, California, after the intervention. You don't observe these ones. But, this is related to, like a very well-known problem in computer science, that is matrix completion. So, like, I think I can do that, like, using matrix completion. And the interesting part about this is that, like, when you think about matrix completion, this is based in, like a low-rank approximation, which brings you kind of directly to, factor models. But factor models is what, in the first place, is motivating the use of synthetic controls in economics, because we are trying to, take advantage of how, like different units can move. So kind of, all this closes the circle, but we have another tool that we can use to, like extend these synthetic control methods in other direction. And I have here like a gallery of people who have been working on this. One of them is like a Mansur, the other one is like Anish that is going to talk later, and also like Denise Shane and Jenja Rahman. Okay, so like this group of people, and now also in collaboration with me, like we produced like a series of papers, like extending synthetic control methods in many dimensions. And this is like a nice, example of the type of collaboration that we can have between people in the social science and people in engineering. For example, here, like I have like I guess Anish is going to talk about that, like an extension of this method to, settings in which you may have multiple interventions. Okay, another thing that I want to mention about my experience at IDSS, like no matter where you go, I think one of the most rewarding things that you do is like interacting with the students, and that was not an exception for like in my experience in IDSS. I want to mention like Jin Lonsao that is somewhere here in the audience over there, and like he was a student at SES when we started collaborating also on synthetic control methods. And we started collaborating on synthetic control methods for experimental design. This is a problem that is quite pervasive right now. Perhaps you may have like a ride-sharing company that was to assess the impact of some new compensation scheme for drivers. Okay, so what they are going to do is like they are going to have like this new program that is going to be applied advertised as a pilot program in one or a very few cities in the United States. Okay, and then like the problem that they have is like which cities should be selected for the program, and which cities we should use as a comparison group to try to reproduce the counterfactual of what would have happened there without the program. Okay? And of course, you can think about, okay, I'm going to randomize, and randomization is going to give you a, ex-ante biasness. Expose probably is going to be terrible, right? Because you only have like a very few numbers of treated units, and like very small number of treated units and very small number of control units. So this is a type of problems that you can approach using synthetic controls, but in this case, what you have to do is you have to have not only a synthetic control, you have to have a synthetic treated. You are going to think which units you are going to, you are going to think about a set of units that are going to reproduce the characteristics of the aggregate, and those units you are going to expose to treatment, and a set of units that are also going to reproduce the characteristic of the aggregate, but those units you are not going to expose to the treatment. And this is a very simple conceptual problem, but it's very tricky computationally. Okay, and one of the many things that Jin Lon bring to this project is like knowledge of how in fact to compute these estimators. Okay, so that's that's another example of how fruitful collaborations can be in this setting. And this is kind of an example of this type of setting. Like all the blue lines here are individual units, and during the estimation period we set like two synthetic units. One is the synthetic treated, that is the dark line, and the synthetic control, that is the this is the dark line, but this continues the dashed line. And both of them are like following the aggregate in the population. Okay, and then like the treated units are going to be treated, of course, and we are going to see like a gap that happens there. after treatment, we are going to attribute this gap to the effect of treatment. We have also here some blank periods that are, before the treatment, they are not used for estimation, they are going to be used for inference. And that's what allow us to see, whether the effect of the treatment is there or not, statistically. So, so as you can see, these type of collaborations have made these methods work in a context where they were not working before. Now synthetic controls methods are widely used in in academia, in industry, government, NGOs. There is very fast-paced literature, I have to say, conference publications, courses, they have been described as arguably the most important innovation in the policy evaluation literature in the last 15 years. So yeah, that's the pitch, I guess. And although econometrics methods are not the staple of the usual staple of the a popular press, synthetic control methods and related methods have managed to capture the attention of journalists and also the readers. And here you have a couple of examples. Okay, and yes, I'm going to conclude with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Anish Agarwal. It's a real pleasure being here with my advisors, all my advisors here, really. So I did my PhD at MIT. I was advised by Alberto, Munzer, and Devrat. And these were all the various places where I did most of my research, which is IDSS, the Statistics Center, LIDS, ECS, and all of them were really quite foundational to my research, as you'll see. I'm currently a postdoc at Amazon, and I'll be starting as faculty at Columbia in June. So the title of my talk is Causal Inference for Engineers, and why is it that engineering can really benefit a lot from causal reasoning and vice versa? And so hopefully I'll motivate that through this talk. So the key framing question for what I do is quite simple, which is what will happen to Y if we do A? Y is some outcome of interest, and A is some action that we can take. And you'll see across a variety of important engineering fields, you can pose questions this way. For example, in, say, networking, you could ask, what will happen to a data center's latency if a new congestion control protocol is introduced? So here, the outcome of interest is, say, the latency of a data center, and the action would be the congestion control protocol. You could say in logistics, what will happen to, say, the total fuel consumption if a new routing policy is introduced? Right? Or say in healthcare, what will happen to a patient's health if a new drug is given to them? And fundamentally, to answer these important questions, what you need to know is the causal effect that A has on Y. Now, what is the problem of asking such what-if questions? The problem is what we all intuitively know is that correlation doesn't equal causation. But just so we're on the same page, let me give you a very simple example that probably a lot of you have seen, but it's amusing nonetheless. So say I give you data of patients who have diabetes, okay? And the y-axis here is the insulin level. That's the outcome of interest. And the x-axis is the drug dosage, the action. Okay, and each point here is the patient's insulin level after a certain drug dosage. Now, if you just naively run a regression, you throw your machine learning method and you run a regression, you'd reach the conclusion that the higher the drug dosage, the higher the insulin level afterwards, which is the exact opposite effect you would expect to see, right, which is pretty absurd. Now, say what happened? So say we divide the patients up into type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes and then run our regression method separately in each of them. Then you reach the opposite conclusion for both groups. That is, the higher the drug dosage, the lower the insulin level afterwards, right? And this phenomena where you see the opposite conclusion being reached once you divide your population in the correct way has been known as Simpson's paradox, and it's been viewed, it's seen widely across many different fields. So what's happening here is that the action, which is A, your drug dosage, and the outcome, which is the insulin, there's an unobserved confounder here, which is your diabetes type. Well, in this case, it's observed, but it could be unobserved. Right? So it could be the case that people with type 1 diabetes, doctors tend to give them a lower drug dosage, and they also tend to have a lower insulin level anyways. And so dealing with these kinds of confounders is at the heart of learning a causal relationship between any two, between an action and an outcome. Okay? So what are some approaches people have taken to causal reasoning for large complex systems? I break it up into two parts. The one is, say, the engineering approach, where you kind of begin with the causal model, right? And this makes sense for systems you can design, such as a data center, robotic fleets, internet, because you can design it, you can come up with a model for what cause and effect is, yeah? And then you try to figure out how good your model is by a system implementation and seeing whether the data reflects the model. The second approach is what I call the social science approach, where you begin with real-world data, and using some sort of clever statistical analysis, you try to back out a causal model. And that makes most sense in systems you can mostly observe, say, like in healthcare policymaking. Okay? And what I think is what one needs to do to really do causal inference of engineering is bridge these two ways of thinking. Okay? So I'll just give you a quick idea of what this means. If, let's say, going from a causal model to real-world data. Generally, the way this is done is we build simulators or we model a problem. Right? So, for example, in robotics, networking, circuits, there are these simulators that people build, say, Gazebo, NS3, and the underlying dynamics of that simulator, in some sense, is encoding causal relationships in your model. Or we try to model a system as we do in, say, LIDS through a linear dynamical system or a queuing model, and the equations of that model, in some sense, are encoding causality. The problem is that as the complexity of engineering systems is increasing and we integrate more with socioeconomic systems, we can't always simulate and model accurately. Okay? So we need new approaches. Now, let's say we want to go from real-world data to a causal model. Probably the number one thing that you can do is begin with an experimental data, right? So you run a randomized control trial. For example, that's what we did with the COVID-19 vaccine. And here you don't have a confounder because you're explicitly flipping a coin to decide what the dosage is, say, right? The problem is you can't always run such randomized control trials. For example, you can't run an RCT in the electric grid, right, or a data center all the time. And so this way of approaching, though it's very clean, is not very feasible as you come to large systems. Probably the way I'm most excited about is where you do causal inference with observational data. We don't have much knowledge of how actions are being picked. So say you're passively collecting data from networks or social media or cyber-physical sensors, smartphones, smartwatches. How do you do causal inference with this kind of system where you don't really have knowledge of how actions are being picked? And obviously the challenges we talked about is unmeasured confounding and its modern data sets, so they're high dimensional and they're noisy. But here is where I think there's great opportunity, because we're collecting this kind of observational data at an unprecedented scale, and you can think of each of them as like a natural experiment that's happening. So how do we share information across these natural experiments, I think, is one of the key things I think is extremely interesting. So how would one go about doing that? I think it's about bridging econometrics and ECS. I think these two fields hold the key to this, and IDSS was key for me in doing this. Why do I think these two fields are so important for this case? Well, I think econometrics is really good about doing causal reasoning despite unmeasured confounding. Right? So what it does is that it tries to find and analyze natural experiments that are happening all around us, and the beautiful frameworks that have come out, such as instrumental variables, regression discontinuity, difference in differences, but it's generally designed for small economic data sets. Right? That's what, that was the key application to begin with. On the other hand, you have something like machine learning, which came from ECS, and it's about prediction with modern data sets, and you have ideas like kernel methods, neural networks, et cetera, that deal with high-dimensional, noisy, sparse data. But they're generally not designed to handle confounding. And so I think by bridging these two fields of causal inference and machine learning and econometrics and ECS, you can get the best of both worlds. So my time at IDSS was about a specific thing, which is one was taking a core idea in econometrics, which is synthetic controls, which was invented by Alberto and his co-authors here, and asked the question of what if an intervention didn't occur? And we try to bridge that with matrix and tensor completion, which is about imputing missing data in a tensor, a matrix or a tensor. And there's the core idea in EECS, stats, and ML. And it's only when I could be at IDSS and talk to Alberto and Devrath and Munza could I really bridge these two things together and come up with a formal question. And so my research at IDSS and my thesis was about two pieces of work. One was synthetic interventions, which took ideas from tensor completion to solve problems in the synthetic controls literature. And the second was causal matrix completion, which is about taking ideas from synthetic controls to the matrix completion literature. So how do you build recommendation systems from offline observational data? Okay? So just to give you a flavor of the types of things I did. So with synthetic interventions, say you have a drug trial. Okay? One way of encoding the data you collect in a drug trial is through a tensor. So rows would be, say, different patients, columns would be different measurements over time, and different slices would be different interventions. Now, each patient, you'll observe them under one of the different interventions, and so you get this sparse tensor. Okay? And you can ask the question, say, what if patients who got the green drug were instead given the blue drug? That really amounts to filling out the missing entries in this tensor in the shaded blue part. Or say I give you a data center, so different rows would be different data centers, columns would be, again, measurements over time, and different slices would be different, say, congestion control policies. You can, again, ask the question, what if the data centers that were in the blue group got the green policy instead? And again, you can think of that as imputing missing entries in this tensor. Right, so what's nice is you can, these different studies or these different kinds of applications induce unique sparsity patterns in your data. And answering these what-if questions really amounts to tensor completion. Right? So this is one way you can bridge these two fields, at least to this particular framework. And it's been widely applied across a variety of different social engineering systems that we had the good fortune to work with while I was at MIT. One was with Taurex Therapeutics. Yeah. And they asked the question of what would happen if a subset of patients were given, people who suffered from Alzheimer's, if they were given a drug, a tensor was induced, and we found a subset of patients that were potentially responsive. We also work with Uber Technologies, where they asked the question of what would passenger wait times be if US cities adopted routing policies outside the US, and you could induce a tensor and we could come up with an answer. And we applied this across a variety of places, like the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, COVID-19 evaluation, with Broad Institute with Caroline on drug design, and Dream11, which is the large e-commerce company. So I just want to give you 30 seconds of where I think this field is going. What are some interesting directions that are at the intersection of econometrics and ECS? So one, I think, is about RL. So I think what is behind some of the most important achievements in RL is having access to an accurate simulator. For example, in board game like Go, which led to AlphaGo, or we build robotic simulators. And so I think one challenge towards the widespread use of RL is how do you build such simulators for complex economic and engineering systems using just historical observational data? And I couldn't help myself. I think another one that I think would be pretty interesting would be something like causal ChatGPT. So I took a phrase here from Noam Chomsky's kind of complaint about ChatGPT. He said, he was talking about an apple dropping, and he said, well, ChatGPT might predict that even though the apple will fall if I open my hand, but it does not give you counterfactual conjectures. And he says the crux of machine learning is description and prediction, does not posit any causal mechanisms. I don't think that's entirely true, because I asked ChatGPT what would happen if I had an apple in my hand and I dropped it, what would happen? And what would happen if I dropped it in space instead? And it figured it out that if you dropped it in space, it wouldn't fall due to the lack of gravity. So it figured this out completely on its own. So there clearly is something there. We shouldn't disregard it. But I think to actually use this in scale, we need to be able to answer such what-if questions in natural language using tabular observational data and with formal uncertainty quantification to be able to do this in practice. And with that, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent. So I'll try to give a brief snapshot about an emerging field at the interface of computation and statistics that tries to understand fundamental limits for solving various statistical inference problems. In many ways, this sort of grew out of MIT, and the center of mass remains at MIT. Since the last 10 years, where this has really exploded, there's been a great deal of impact, including a Simon semester dedicated to this topic and other events. So I'll try to just give kind of a flavor of where things are and where things are going. Excellent. Okay, so everybody has their favorite machine learning or statistics problem. At a very high level, most of these can be thought of as some sort of estimation of a signal in noise. Maybe you see a picture for your own favorite problem, and maybe you don't. If you don't see it there, please send me a photo, and I'll include it. Good. So with that, the basic question that motivates many of us is, when can you solve a given problem? Okay, so you have some data set of some given quality, and you want to know, can I solve it? Okay, so that's the basic question. Now, a field has been studying this for over 100 years. The field of mathematical statistics aims to address, well, how much data do I need? And there's some fundamental limit, and if I have more than that, then there exists an algorithm that can solve the problem. The issue is that many of these modern problems are also computationally constrained. They really require a lot of computational resource. And statistics doesn't have a systematic study of computational feasibility. That's just not been the focus, and there's not a set of techniques for thinking about this question. Well, as far as computation goes, everybody here knows the entire field of computer science is aimed at addressing how much computational resource do I need to solve a given problem. Unfortunately, this has had little to say about statistics problems. aside from maybe the small caveat of cryptography, which studies problems of this flavor, because these problems are data problems. The input is given by some data, and it's not given by some adversary. Okay, so we need to think about combining these two fields at the interface to address the real question of, can I solve the problem that I want to solve? It's a data problem, and I'm computationally limited. It turns out there's a beautiful interplay, so one cannot just think about these two things in isolation. Really, it's required to combine them. And sort of the caricature is that maybe if I have a great deal of computational power that require less data, you could think of it as a needle in a haystack kind of problem. If I have a huge needle, maybe something very crude, I kind of smear the hay around and the needle sticks out, will work. Alternatively, if there's a weaker signal, then maybe I require more computation. Or vice versa, if I have a lot of computation, I don't need as much data. A toy problem that exhibits this sort of phenomenon is this planted-clique problem. It's my own maybe favorite problem, as well as various people in this room. If you've never seen this, there's a graph, and the graph is some noisy graph. You could think of it as a random graph. And there's a clique that's embedded in it. There's k nodes, of which every pair have an edge. Of course, you don't see them colored in red, and the question is, well, can you find the clique? Or even, is there a clique given such a graph? Okay, so this is a sort of quintessential problem that exhibits a trade-off between computational and statistical resource. And here there's just one parameter, the size of the clique. So you might ask, well, what size clique do I need to solve this? Well, the information limit is given by something that's logarithmic in the size of the graph. Whoops, it seems like nothing here loaded. That's unfortunate. Well, I'll just have to use the laser to say there's a computational limit that's not the information limit. You can imagine some other line here. Okay, and that's a dramatic difference. It's something much, much bigger than this log n. It's square root of n. That's really all you need to know about planted clique. It's a very clean stylized problem, and there are two distinct thresholds. One is the information threshold, log n. One is the computational threshold, that's root n. And there have been algorithms that achieve all the way to here. There's no algorithm that's polytime that works here, but there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that maybe it's computationally hard in that regime. Okay, now this sort of thing turns out to also be present in various statistical problems of interest, and so I'm going to draw a diagram for sparse PCA. Don't worry if you've never seen sparse PCA. It's just sort of a quintessential high-dimensional statistics problem. And Philippe first started studying this problem. Other people studied it first, but he made an observation, which is that there's a threshold between impossible and possible, based on is there enough information to solve the problem. However, he was very troubled by the fact that all the efficient algorithms failed to achieve the information theoretic minimum. So something similar is going on as in planted clique. And indeed, what he showed is, assuming that planted clique is hard, that this gap has real meaning. It's not just that we're not smart enough to come up with better algorithms, but indeed, there's something fundamental here. So there's a different computational limit rather than the fundamental statistical limit. And this computational limit is what we should be thinking about. That's what matters in practice. Right? You don't have exponential time or infinite time to run your algorithms. Okay, so since then, there's been a great deal of work by dozens and dozens of people, including me and co-authors, to fill out this diagram in various ways, and various subtleties arise. But the point is, a great deal of effort has been invested, and on some level, we understand this problem. Okay, so stepping back a bit, there's this field that tries to understand computation for statistics problems. There's kind of four broad goals. First off, what is this computational limit, and do we have evidence for it? Can we find efficient algorithms that achieve this limit that now has meaning because it's somehow fundamental? Stepping back, can we understand relationships between problems as opposed to studying problems in isolation? And alternatively, can we understand relationships between classes of algorithms that can give us insight into what sort of algorithm or what class of algorithms might be optimal for which type of problem? So again, just to highlight, MIT and SDSC and IDSS has really been central in this field and kind of remains a center of mass. In every single one of these directions, much of the central and groundbreaking work is by MIT folks. And one of the reasons is that this field in particular combines ideas and traditions from statistics, probability, theoretical computer science, information theory, statistical physics, and other fields, all kind of in one place. And MIT is the perfect place, and SDSC is the perfect place to do that. So let me say a few things about each of these directions. First, I'll focus on the first two. So how do you find the computational threshold and give evidence for it, and how do you find efficient optimal algorithms? So more so maybe on the understanding the fundamental limit, there are kind of three broad approaches that have gained popularity. First is average case reductions. This is analogous to what's been done in worst case complexity, but for these sort of statistical problems where the input is given by some data distribution. So there's kind of a body of work in that direction. Another direction is restricted models of computation. So here one studies a class of algorithms and tries to understand what is the very best that this can do against a certain type of problem. So if one understands that, for instance, sum of squares achieves exactly up until this threshold, we believe sum of squares is maybe a powerful class of algorithms. This suggests that there's some intrinsic meaning to this particular threshold. Now, of course, there are different classes of algorithms. Each has their own strengths. And so one can analyze different classes of algorithms for different problems. And then finally, there's a somewhat related approach, which is to study energy landscapes and properties of the solution space. And this has also sort of gained popularity and has seen a lot of success, especially by David Gumarnik and co-authors. Okay, so stepping more broadly, beyond this, can we understand relationships between problems, and can we understand relationships between classes of algorithms? So kind of the caricature is that we have many classes of algorithms here. Choose your favorite. And we have many problems. There's dozens, if not tens or close to 100 problems maybe that are of wide study. And a priori, you might study a particular problem, and this has been done in each of the classes of algorithms, has been carefully analyzed for this planted clique problem that we saw. Now, of course, this is sort of unsustainable if you want to generalize this approach, because just the scaling law of the number of edges here in this graph is it's bad news, right? I mean, it's going to take the next 100 years to fill in all these edges. Okay, so we want to do something better, right? Okay, so how are we going to do things? Well, the first broad approach is to find edges within one side, within the left-hand side. Okay, and so this may be a caricature of where things stand right now. There's relationships between classes of algorithms. There's also this orange box here, which is this overlap gap property, this kind of structural property. And what's interesting here is that this landscape property has implications to various classes of algorithms. So if this happens, then various entire classes fail. And so this is a simplification of the landscape of algorithms. It allows us to think in a coherent way about what algorithms might we want to use for different problems. Okay. Turning to the right-hand side, we might want to find edges amongst those things, those problems. That's really the direction that me and my group have been really focused on in the last maybe 7-8 years. With my former student Matt Brennan, we have this diagram of reductions between problems, which suggests that really something is possible here in terms of finding average case reductions between problems and kind of simplifying the landscape. At the same time, there's a great deal of work still left to do. So jointly with Cheng-Hao Guo in the audience and Yuri Polyansky, we're working on really coming up with strong equivalences between problems. So not just kind of concluding hardness from one problem to another, but really saying, this entire class of problems are strongly equivalent. You might as well just study one of them. With that, I'll end and leave you with a few thoughts here. Thanks.
All right. So I'm Philippe Rigollet. I'm with IDSS and the math department. Actually, I was one of the first hires jointly between these departments. And I'd like to, so I'm going to talk to you about optimal transport and statistical optimal transport, which is a topic we've been studying. And I think it really illustrates the ties between statistics, mathematics, and computation in many ways. I will choose a snippet. I only have a short amount of time. And I'd like to also show how it's pervasive also through many of the efforts at MIT. And just like what Guy was mentioning, MIT is actually a center of gravity for many of the questions around optimal transport. So optimal transport is a mathematical field by definition. I call it mathematical optimal transport, but it's like fries in France. We don't call them French fries. So mathematicians don't call optimal transport mathematical optimal transport. But there's multiple Fields medals that have been awarded to people doing optimal transport, like Cedric Villani, Alessio Fegali, and there's lots of books. And I actually tried to go through those books at some point in my younger career. I was kind of thrown out by all the fluid mechanics going on in there. It was a bit complex until some more palatable books came in, and actually one of the influential line of work was on computational optimal transport. So starting with a work by Couturi, and in fact my colleague Justin Solomon in CSAIL, so people have started devising algorithms that were extremely powerful and were able to actually scale up some ideas of optimal transport to some unsuspected areas of data science. And I'll illustrate it. There's some really nice, so Justin works in graphics, so there's really nice visual illustrations coming with this. And this really started spreading the word of optimal transport. It's actually a beautiful field. And I'd like to talk to you about its new incarnation, which I call statistical optimal transport. We'll see that it's not a well-defined term. I'm actually writing some lecture notes, so this is like a temporary Springer color. So I'm actually teaching a class this semester on this, and I'm hoping to have lecture notes that are ready by the end of the semester. So, as I said, statistical optimal transport is mostly a counterpoint to computational optimal transport. But basically, it encompasses somewhat heterogeneous ideas, which is, what is the interface between optimal transport and statistics? So there could be some questions around optimal transport. For example, it's a distance between probability measures. Can you understand, what is the distance between some measure on data and some real measure, things like this. You could also try to estimate quantities arising from optimal transport. I'll mention that briefly towards the end. We have some nice biological applications, so there's coupling in particular that allow you to reconnect to data sets. And the third one is to actually use optimal transport as a geometry that allows you to do optimization, which in fact, all optimization on this space of probability measures embodies some interesting statistical tasks. And that's what I would like to actually describe today. So let's start with a simple question. So if you can do this, congratulations. You've earned your spot at MIT today. So we know how to compute averages between numbers. And we even know how to do fancier things. We know how to compute averages between vectors. And if I start asking you what is the average between those two shapes, then maybe there's multiple answers to this, right? Maybe you're going to say, well, I just take the two images, I put 1/2 on the first one, 1/2 on the second one, I put my pixels half colored, and this is what the average should look like. But you could just say, well, those, could say, well, it's an ellipse, so it's going to be something that has some average shape, for example. There's multiple answers to this. And optimal transport actually provides a coherent answer to this question. Okay, and so more generally here, I've been talking about shapes, and optimal transport is about probability distributions, but it turns out that many data, including shapes, but also here I have point clouds coming from LiDAR data, scans, or some meshes, some curves, all these things can be coded as probability distributions. So once you actually take your object of interest and turn it into this, you can actually just manipulate probability distributions using optimal transport. So if I give you a nice way to take averages between probability distributions, then you're going to have a nice way to do averages between those complex objects. So boils down to this question: what is the average between two probability distributions? And there's many ways to do this. There's some simple ones, but there's some more geometric ones. So for example, here, if my first one puts mass here and the other one puts mass there, maybe the average should put mass somewhere in the middle. And that's what optimal transport does for you. And in fact, it defines this space of probability measures, which is curved. So it's positively curved. You want to think of it maybe as a sort of irregular sphere, right? Some deflated soccer ball, maybe. And so this is exactly the one that will actually capture those geometric features that we were looking for in this shape averaging, for example. Okay, so this line that I drew is called the geodesic, right? This is, typically the shortest path between 2 points. Again, think of the sphere. It's a good way to keep that in mind. And so once we have this, we would like to actually think of it as like a full-blown, what we call Riemannian manifold. So, an object that's curved, that's kind of looking like, 2 or 3-dimensional space, but on which we can actually do some calculus. There's like, derivatives, integrals, stuff like this. So this is what it looks like, right? It's a curved space. I take 2 measures, mu0 and mu1. Those are my 2 complex objects. And I would like to be able to define a geodesic, and I just showed you that optimal transport allows us to do this. And more generally, I would like to be able to talk about curves. Like, what does it mean to move along this space? Okay? So if I want to talk about a curve in geometry, I need to give you an idea of which direction this curve is going, all right? So I need to talk to you about some velocity, for example, the initial velocity of this curve. And it turns out that this object is precisely an optimal transport map. It's really a displacement map, but you can construct it directly. There's a one-to-one correspondence with those velocities and an optimal transport map. So this is a core object in optimal transport that allows you to transfer one distribution to another one. So once you have this curve, you can actually talk about, this actually gives you a differential structure. I'm giving you initial velocities, and you can start taking derivatives along curves. You can talk about gradients. You can do a lot of things that are actually very powerful once I actually give you this thing. This is called autocalculus. It's named after Felix Otto, who came up with this idea, and that was later made more formal by Ambrosio Gili and Savary. And so what do I do with this calculus? Well, same thing that you do with calculus when you have, like, your vanilla functions. So here it's called functional. It takes a distribution and puts it as a number, right? Takes a distribution measure and gives you a number. For example, the variance of a distribution is a functional, right? I take the Gaussian distribution, I return the number 2. That's the variance of this distribution. And so once you have this functional, you would like to say, how does it change if I change a little bit my probability measure, right? I want to understand the variations, and that's encoded in derivatives, and more generally, it's encoded in gradients. But here, the gradient is a complex object, right? Because when I think about what the derivative is, it's like, df over dx, but the dx is just like a difference between measures, and here I have to think about measures moving along this curve. And so when I do this, I get a notion of gradient, which is called the Wasserstein gradient. So it's an object that actually is a vector field on the space on which I'm actually working on. And once I have a gradient, I actually can talk about a gradient flow. Okay, so a gradient flow is just basically something that follows the steepest descent. All right, so I have a functional. I would like to find the distribution that minimizes this functional. And this is a partial differential equation. There's some nice connections to it. And you can actually come up with some really nice things that you can do with this. So this is actually what I mentioned. This was Justin's original work. So you could define the barycenter functional. If this squared W2 thing was just a Euclidean distance, that would just be the solution would be the weighted average. So this is a way to compute weighted averages of complex objects. And you can see here, you see weighted average of a cow and a donut or something like this, and a duck. And this has been very nice. You could also try to minimize some distances between a target distribution, and we use this for sampling and variational inference when you have the Kalbach-Leibler divergence that shows up that enables some particle methods to do this. And you can also do this, of course, to optimize over some measures, and that is something that shows up in Gaussian mixture modeling when you talk about NPMLE. So there's other things you could do with optimal transport, which are more corresponding to the first 2 bullet points that I mentioned. You could do transfer learning, as I said, to reconnect one data set to another one by pushing them through some optimal transport map. We applied it in some collaboration with the Broad Institute for cellular trajectory reconstruction across different time points. And Caroline here has also worked on this problem. You could do things that are completely different using objects from optimal transport. Viktor Chinozukov and co-authors used it to define notions of depth in high-dimensional spaces and ranks and things like this. And all these ideas we captured in a Simons Institute program actually in the fall of 21, where many participants from this group were. And it's also one of the groups in FOTSI, which is this Foundations of Data Science Institute that's co-led by Piotr Indyk here and Peter Bartlett at Berkeley, and I'm a PI on, and Deepa Radis as well. And so this is very much an active area of research. Beyond this Wasserstein space, optimization over curve spaces is something that really is coming up. Many of us are actually working on applications of these questions that are connected, so I needed 8 photos, so if you're not on this photo, please don't be offended. I just picked 8 photos of people in the group that were actually working on this. All right, so I will thank you for your attention and here.
Right. I'm Sasha Rakhlin. I'm going to be talking on foundations of interactive decision-making and reinforcement learning. This is a subject I've been interested in the last 3 years, and all the credit goes to these wonderful people at the bottom. Especially, I want to highlight Dylan Foster, who's been instrumental in driving much of this work. At least one person, Yan Jun, is in the audience. Okay, so we're broadly interested in the following decision-making problem, which takes place over T rounds. At each round, the decision maker on the left, let's say a doctor, observes the context. That could be a patient with a medical history and symptoms that comes to the doctor. So that's XT. The doctor then makes a decision, pi T, such as a treatment strategy, and observes reward at some point later maybe, and some auxiliary observation that allows the doctor to learn about the disease progression and so forth. So the hope is that over time, the doctor is making better and better decisions for these different people, and the doctor might not see the same person twice, might not observe the same context twice, and so it is a learning problem. I would argue this is a ubiquitous problem. For instance, in advertisement or personalization, it's exactly the same type of problem that's encountered. Stated the way that I stated, in fact, subsumes episodic reinforcement learning. So we're thinking of problems where the decisions could be very complicated objects, such as multi-stage policies. So the doctor could be making a decision, which itself is a multi-stage treatment strategy. One can say that if we don't understand reinforcement learning, why try to solve this more abstract problem? And in fact, this is a case where making things abstract clears your mind and makes it feasible to attack the problem. The setting, as I described, in fact subsumes a variety of known problems, such as multi-arm bandits, structured bandits, contextual bandits, MDPs, and what we call decision-making with structured observations. So what is the goal in this setup? The goal is to, in fact, think about complex decisions and use complex nonlinear models, for instance, deep neural networks, to model the outcomes, to model the rewards, and so forth. We would like, as statisticians, to ask, in this problem, what is the statistical complexity given a class of models? How many examples does a doctor need to see to hone in on a good policy? And what are the basic algorithmic principles? These are the two computational and statistical problems. And why hasn't this done before? Well, it's a difficult problem because there is no principled way in the literature for trading off information that we get and reward, the information that the doctor gets and the reward. Much of what we do in statistics and beyond can be written in the following way. This is if we would like a method to work on a class of models, we write it often as a minimax problem, where the minimum is over all algorithms and max is over models in the class of possible models. And you would like to understand performance of the algorithm on M for the possibly worst case model in the class M. Typically, if you're in statistics, mathematical statistics, you're studying, let's say, estimation of Holder functions or what have you. You would write quantities like this. And typically, there is not an easy way to solve this min-max. Even though this is the object we're interested in, there is not an easy way to solve it because the space of algorithms is huge. One can say, well, this is an optimization, min-max optimization problem, but it's an unfeasible space to be working in. One of the intellectual contributions, I think, of this line of work is that we said that it's enough to look at algorithms that are split into two parts. One does online estimation and the other one does exploration. So once we fix online estimation, we can, in fact, solve exactly the exploration problem. So figure out exactly what we need to do to explore in the most efficient way. And by doing so, we're in fact able to get upper and lower bounds on this minimax objective to within certain factors. So nearly matching upper and lower bounds. And this is at the level of generality of this abstract setting that I mentioned. Okay, I'm not sure if we want to go into the details, but something like this comes out. We call it the decision estimation coefficient. We first introduced the Lagrangian version of this, and Yanjun refined this further into this constraint form. And essentially what it does is it looks at a Holder ball around an estimated model and asks for the best randomization procedure and the worst model in the class, what could be the gap in the regret if we constrain the model to be close to the one that's being estimated. You can ask whether this leads to any real-world algorithms, and the answer is yes. So one of the first methods we came up with in Contextual Bandits is in fact now part of this Wobbit library that's open source, and it works very well on real data. So just because the space of the algorithms was not really known, one couldn't just ask ChatGPT-4 to come up with a method, and so you actually have to solve some min-max problems. For those who are from stats department, they might notice some similarity to what's called modules of continuity in statistical estimation of linear functionals. This is something that goes back to Donoghue and Liu in 87, 91. Yuri Polyansky and Yong Wu worked on this. Indeed, one can view the object that I put on the previous slide as an analog of these modules of continuity, and one can see the theory that we're developing as extending the classical theory of statistical estimation to interactive decision making. I think I'll stop here and yield the rest of my time to the next speaker. Thank you.
It's working now. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Martin Wainwright. I'm joint in EECS and mathematics. I'll actually be the next incoming director of IDSS, so hope to talk and interact with many of you in the course of that duty. But today I want to talk a little more specifically about statistics and I guess some problems in the general area of what I would call statistics with constraints. I've sort of chosen problems where I think there's particular overlap with things that have been done and are being done at IDSS, and also directions that I think are interesting for future work. Okay, so statistics with constraints, in some ways that's redundant, because part of statistics is basically about inferring things about the real world based on a limited number of samples. And collecting data can be expensive, so there's always a notion of constraints in statistics. What's interesting here is that in many cases there's an additional form of constraint that's being introduced, and that makes the problem much richer. So for the first set of constraints actually we've already heard from. Guy gave a very nice overview of, this is not working. Yeah, I just tried the arrows, okay. Oh, now it's working, yeah. So I'll talk about 4 types of constraints. Guy already gave us a very nice overview of computational constraints. And this is really fundamental, and as Guy said, has led to a beautiful and blossoming line of work. So Guy mentioned this problem, just to give you a different snapshot of it. Johnstone and Liu introduced this problem of what's known as sparse PCA. So PCA is a form of dimensionality reduction. You have a high dimensional signal. You want to find a lower dimensional space in which interesting things are happening. Sparsity is the interesting extension where you believe that only a small subset of your features are actually relevant. So from a statistical point of view, it becomes this problem of you observe a large matrix with thousands or hundred thousands of entries, and you'd like to detect a planted component to it, in this case, a plant that's low rank and sparse. So we can sort of see it appearing there. But in general, the question is, if I gave you this noisy thing, can you see it? You can probably see it post hoc, but maybe not a priori. And so, like Guy said, the interesting thing here is that this is a very simple problem. It's important in applications, but one where you see a pretty pronounced statistical computational gap. So you can use basic techniques in information theory to show that you have one curve. If I plot the model complexity, I plot model complexity versus sample size. There's one curve that governs whether or not you can recover this planted component using any computational procedure. And there's another curve higher up requiring a larger sample size where known polynomial time procedures work. So my own work in this area was just to analyze an SDP relaxation that was introduced by Daspremont et al. But it was quite frustrating because we couldn't show that it did anything different than a very naive method that just looked at the diagonal of the matrix and was, much, much cheaper. And then the seminal work of Philippe Rigollet with his student at the time, Quentin Berthet, established this connection to average case complexity. And then as Guy told us more about, there's been a very rich story, much of it at IDSS and MIT, that's unrolled around this and many other related problems. So I see this is a really exciting and fertile area moving forward. Another kind of constraint that's very interesting are privacy constraints. This is not a new idea. Privacy in statistics goes back to work in survey sampling. If you ask people delicate questions, you may be worried that they don't give accurate answers because, if I say, do you smoke marijuana, are you going to say yes or no? There might be some incentive misalignment. But with large-scale data collection, this has become much, much more significant since the 60s. So 2 high-profile incidents. There was a big controversy, an article in Scientific American about privacy issues associated with collecting genetic data. So think before you spit. ChatGPT, not necessarily my favorite thing, but there are definitely privacy issues surrounding it. And just last week, Italy passed laws having to do with privacy and use of ChatGPT data. So the question here, I think, actually strikes to the heart of what IDSS is meant to address. There's obviously societal benefits to being able to aggregate various kinds of data. If I have data from many individuals and I'm studying the biological basis of disease, unquestionable social utility. But there's obviously privacy concerns, so how do we negotiate these trade-offs? This is a big area, there's lots of work, but one way to formalize it is by the notion of what's called local differential privacy. It's essentially a way of controlling disclosure risk. You want to think about you have 2 data sets, and someone has perturbed one individual in the data set. Can you tell the difference between these 2 data sets by what you observe? A mechanism is locally differentially private if it makes that testing problem hard, if it makes it hard for disclosure risk to arise. And local differential privacy has a privacy level alpha, and it provides a bound. It says that you're suitably close to a random guess if alpha is small. If alpha is in the region of 0.1, you can't do much better than random guessing. Okay, so Apple uses this protocol. If you look in your iPhone and you dig in the code, you can find what alpha they use. Their alpha is very large. Apple's using a value of alpha that's so large that it's kind of a bit meaningless, the sense of privacy that they're actually guaranteeing. But in any case, the trade-offs here are interesting. So you fix an alpha, and you want to solve some statistical problem. Maybe you want to estimate a density in this example. There's, again, a similar kind of phase diagram as in the computational space between what you can do with private data and what you can do with no privacy constraint. And so the price of privacy, for instance, in this problem is you have both a shift. You basically lose a large constant fraction of your sample size, and also the rate at which your error goes to 0, that rate, the slope of this line on a log scale changes. So the effects of privacy can be pretty dramatic, and essentially I think naive notions of privacy are so strong that it says you can't really do anything at all statistically useful with your data. So lots of things to think about in this space. Two more quick things just to wrap up, and this also connects to both Alberto's and Anish's talk, talking about problems of causal inference, trying to answer counterfactual queries. So here's the standard binary treatment causal problem. You have a population of individuals, you have features or contexts, covariates associated with them. You have a decision to treat or not treat. But we're looking at observational data in this case. The doctor has chosen to treat or not treat based on his or her assessment of a patient. So that's a kind of form of confounding. So confounding, of course, is central in these problems. What people do is they introduce more covariates to eliminate confounding. But from a statistical point of view, when you introduce more covariates, your problem dimension blows up, becomes statistically harder. So there's again a trade-off here between confounding and statistical accuracy. So these kinds of coverage, data coverage issues are equally fundamental in the area of causal inference. Last thing I'll say is another interesting area is the use of active learning or adaptive algorithms for data collection. As I mentioned before, often data collection is very expensive. You might have a large-scale physics model where you have to run a simulator just to collect a data point. So you're tempted to use sequential schemes that are quite clever about how they collect data. But adaptive data collection is a double-edged sword because it can allow you to sort of focus in on parts of the problem more quickly. This is an illustration for a bandit problem. You can sort of learn the optimal arm for a bandit quite quickly. But learning the optimal arm is not the end of the story. Often that decision is fed in along with uncertainty into a broader set of decisions that need to be made downstream. So you need to quantify uncertainty. And many of these algorithms destroy all the classical asymptotic approximations. These two curves are showing you that an ordinary non-adaptive algorithm, of course, is asymptotically Gaussian, but adaptivity destroys that. How do you fix that? What is the price of adaptivity? There are actually prices. Sometimes you actually have to pay a log n price or larger in terms of the width of a confidence interval that you could generate from adaptively collected data. So I think in general, this area of statistics with constraints that are informed by societal or scientific considerations is very interesting, and I think IDSS is a great place to continue working forward on these problems. Thanks.
There we go. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. Well, so I am the last speaker. My name is Ashia Wilson. I recently joined the EECS department, and I decided that given all these speakers did a lot to discuss some of my previous work, I'd mention a module of my current work that I think very much touches on what statistics can provide for people considering more societally driven questions. So the name of this talk is Value-Driven Foundation Models. So as you guys know, there's been this proliferation of foundation models. So as Martin mentioned, we have ChatGPT, we have all these new exciting models that have sparked people to exclaim that AI has arrived. So there's been a lot of hype around these models. And what is commonly shared amongst these models is that they're trained on large-scale internet data. often this data is common across all these models, and a lot of pre-training happens where weights are shared across models. So a lot of people have been calling for a more value-driven framework for thinking about these foundation models. There have been a variety of concerns that have been discussed, such as copyright and fair use, so very high-profile situations where some of these makers are being sued by various people, including artists, for copyright infringement. Twitter also is suing Clearview or is declaring that Clearview should remove things from their service. There's also this right to privacy to be forgotten that's been discussed and elaborated upon. So in Europe, there are way more strong protections than there are in the US. However, California has passed legislation, and a lot of people have been trying to drive or call for a pause in these models until we have more reinforced litigation trying to understand how do we protect privacy. So as was touched upon, some of the people at IDSS, as well as others, have been also thinking about what are the economics of large-scale data. In particular, should there be a mechanism by which people are paid or share in the profits driven by this new economy that's arising? And so some of the people in my group have begun to start thinking about some of these questions. And last, but of course not least, is the ethics of scale and bias. So this has been a long-ranging concern in ML, and it's been exacerbated by the proliferation of these models. One interesting thing that has arisen is that as these models are, as models are scaled and shared across many different data modalities, data sharing has led to a lot of homogeneity in outcomes. So there's been a lot of work showing suboptimality for sharing data, and there's this concern that this could drive bias for a variety of outcomes. So today I want to talk about the role of statistics in basically mitigating some of these concerns. So one salient concern is how do we attribute the contribution of individual examples to predictions? This is the so-called data attribution problem. In particular, there have been a variety of tools proposed, one of which I'll mention next, but there's still interesting, outstanding questions that I want to leave the audience with that I believe statistics can address, which is how can we make methods for data attribution reliable for large-scale nonlinear models? Many of our techniques don't scale. And can we design methods that where no one data point contributes more to some threshold amount? And this could help with copyright infringement. Last but not least, privacy was highlighted. Should we train all foundation models to be differentially private? And how do we characterize privacy loss in foundation models? So this was recently improved upon for convex models, but for non-convex models, this is not as well understood. And the one vignette of research that my group has worked on that I want to highlight is this last question of can we develop quick and more precise deletion methods that protect user privacy upon request? So this is for models that aren't trained to be differentially private, but are tasked with perhaps deleting a user's data from not just its inventory, but from the model it's trained on. How do we do that efficiently? So in a recent work with one of my students, we developed or improved upon this one technique, which is called influence functions. It's a very classical statistics technique that has been used or proposed for data attribution, for data deletion, prediction robustness, generating confidence intervals, and the like. So this is a very common technique, and it's just based on a very simple optimization procedure. Here we try to develop a kind of modification of this influence function so that it can be applied to a larger class of non-smooth models in a quick and especially online manner. Oftentimes, these deletion requests come in a streaming fashion where people observe that there's harm being done and want their data deleted from a model and from a server. And companies need to be able to comply quickly with these requests. Due to the accuracy and privacy trade-off, it is often the case that companies may not want to actually train their models to be differentially private. And here we show that it's actually better in terms of accuracy to train your model in a very common way and then delete data after the fact. So in particular, we prove these algorithms provide better accuracy in the resulting model than differentially private techniques, and we prove that previous state-of-the-art methods actually continue to leak information if hyperparameter tuning is involved. So I think there's actually a lot to be done here. We're trying to scale this up to more complex nonlinear models. But in general, my group is just really excited about the series of questions I brought up in terms of the problems, the more social issues that arise for foundation models, and how do we make them more value-driven. So with that vignette, I will end, and luckily I think ending early so that we can continue on with this wonderful celebration. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. So now we have until 12:30 to open it up for discussion. So we've got microphones at both aisles, and we can take any questions from the audience. And if not, I've got some questions here too. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask our panel? So maybe I'll start off, and you guys can mull it over in the meantime. So the talks were really wonderful. One of the things that struck me was, they were very outwards looking, especially when you look at one after another all these talks. We saw applications of statistical thinking ranging from, healthcare, biology, computer vision, privacy, and fairness. And really, IDSS and SDSC are set up to try and foster this kind of collaboration. So in the time since the founding of IDSS, I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on what have we learned about what makes these collaborations work? Maybe you could speak from experience about what kinds of setups, allow you to push your problems in new directions, and I'd love to hear from you guys. Don't be shy. It's on.
All right, so I guess I'll take it. So maybe I'm not the one that's the most involved with applications, but I do have some collaborations with the Broad Institute. This is just a personal interest of mine. I really believe that genomics is generating extremely exciting data. I found that experimental biologists have this amazing hunch about which experiment is going to generate data that will allow you to have some insight about a particular phenomenon, but they don't actually know yet how to extract this information. And so they come with, blank slate and say, okay, we have this basic idea. And I think intellectually it's very rewarding for people like me to be able to think quite freely about the kind of questions that they're asking. They don't say, I want you to predict the next thing, or I want you to, I guess visualization is something they're really into in particular. They would like to get some insight. So if you can show them what it looks like, I think that's something they value. And so the way my collaborations have worked, and I'm actually actively trying to develop them, is really a question of aligning incentives, I find. So in particular, my community, which is more statistics and machine learning, will value, say, theorems, algorithms, maybe some, fast experiments, and that's what I like, and that's my culture. And at the same time, of course, biologists care more about, applications and biological insight and discovery, which I care about, but I'm not an expert. And I find that having respect for each other's incentives is really what makes these collaborations actually work. They're not trying to enroll me to compute 16 p-values a day, and I'm not trying to enroll them to just run experiments on real data for me. And I think really trying to respect each other's agenda and incentives is something that has worked. It took a while, quite a bit of tinkering to get there, but in the end, I think it worked really well, and I feel there's a spectrum of people, from very theoretical to very biological, I'd say, more than applied, where everybody finds some interest in these collaborations. And with the new technologies that are coming out of the Broad and the new data that's coming out of the Broad, there's really a great playground for us to play with. We have a reading group going on right now, and thanks to the Schmidt Center and Caroline, and yeah, it's a pretty exciting time to be involved in these applications. But I would also like to hear about people that have more social applications and see how they align their incentives actually.
I guess that Philippe was referring to me. This reminded me, like the other day we have a seminar in statistics, and we both of us were there, and the speaker started with the theoretical model, and I raised my hand, like you should start with the application, and Philippe was, you never do that in a statistics seminar, right? And for me, it's yes, it's a little bit more difficult to think about that because we, at least in econometrics, you have to have this idea that you have to immediately transition to the application. But what I learned on IDS is much of this enrichment happens by osmosis. I mean, you're next to people, and you have to do many things with them. You have to, organize seminars, teach courses, and advise students, and you end up learning what these people they care about, and how it relates with what you care about. And many times, this collaboration happens through it's just being together in a place like this, and there are many activities that we don't count, they are going to create collaborations, but in fact I think they do create collaborations, and of course you can always give incentives, and IDSS has been doing much of that, right, in terms of funding and so on. But again, I think that having a place that is not a web page. It's a physical place where people have offices, have students, and teach courses and organize seminars. I think is the is what makes the entire difference for me.
So I guess just to add to that, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is really about building bridges. And I think for me, one of the challenges that I very much deal in abstraction, so finding the right kinds of collaborators who can speak your language and interpolate between you on the one hand, who thinks more in terms of abstractions, and someone else who's more domain-driven, seems challenging. But at least the quality of the students and postdocs seems to really help you navigate that space. Because as much as we're trained in traditional things, like I'm a theoretical computer scientist, it seems like students and postdocs come into IDSS and they don't necessarily have that same party line of I'm trained in this field. They seem to really absorb influences from around them in a way that makes them sort of the glue that makes these projects stick together. So maybe let me lead into my next question, which is, before IDSS was founded, we very famously did not have as much of a centralized statistics presence at MIT. And I think IDSS was designed in many ways to try and overcome this issue, to create a place where people who have statistical interests can come and meet, can collaborate, can be influenced by each other. But one of the things I find myself wondering is, how is the way we educate students in statistics going to evolve over the next few years? If we had had a statistics department for a long time, you could imagine we would be doing things a certain way. But now, to what extent is there a broader foundation that we expect our students to be familiar with so that they can participate with us in these exciting directions? So any comments from the panel would be great.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very thoughtful comment that you've made, Ankur. I don't have clear answers, but I think the delicacy here is that statistics is in some ways quite classical, or has been, and has many wonderful things. It has an extraordinary intellectual legacy, and that's something that we need very much to embrace. But simultaneously, I think the most exciting directions exist at these kind of interfaces that many of the speakers have been talking about, and that Mike Jordan was talking about in his plenary this morning. So I think the tension is that you want to preserve sort of the essential intellectual core that's statistics and probability and this kind of thinking. Preserve statistical thinking in some ways is subtle. I think Mike Zipser sort of made the point that it is mathematical it's a mathematical science, but it's not mathematics per se. There's some sort of subtlety that one wants to bring to a data analytic question or thinking about model validation, robustness, things like that. So I think the tension is to preserve these good things, the subtlety of statistical thinking, but to be forward-looking and engage with other fields. But I'm quite optimistic. I think I very much enjoyed the panel partly because it gave me an opportunity to hear all the wonderful things that colleagues are doing. Sometimes I feel like my colleagues are doing great things. I never hear about them. I hear about them secondhand because someone said, I don't know, Ankur gave a great talk at Stanford last week or something. So having opportunities like this, I think, is great. I think encouraging our students and sort of just building a culture while, we all have our points of view and our particular way of tackling problems. Philippe's point about incentive mechanisms and just being broad-minded to understand different points of view, that's, I think, essential to collaborations. So I see challenges, but I think it's very, very exciting. I think, arguably we're living at one of the most exciting times, this incredible confluence of like data, computation, and just impact across science and engineering at enormous scale. So I feel very lucky personally.
It is an excellent panel, amazing talks. I'm going to ask a question, which is, I think, the question that all of us as colleagues at IDSS and more broadly within MIT have tried thinking about, and maybe as we think about, let's say, statistics and computation, especially sitting there, got great theoretical computer science interacting with great social science, interacting with great statistics. But if we think from building systems perspective, thinking about software and thinking about hardware, connections with that in this ecosystem is missing. It's not that it is missing from MIT. Amazing computer scientists, amazing electrical engineering, and not only just within EECS, but more broadly, are present at MIT. Just before IDSS started, a lot of statistics existed across institution. So one question is, and I think I'm asking it to myself as much as to all of us, is how do we sort of try to think about maybe making a step towards? Again, it's a question that I personally have been mulling about with all of our colleagues here for a long, long time. So I know it's an unfair question, but I think I couldn't hope for a better chance to ask this question than this one, because nobody else is asking question and great people are here.
So sorry, the question is more about also how do we integrate more with system level thinking on the engineering side in statistics, or?
Let's say, it's an unfair comparison, but I think given that, Martin, you're coming from Berkeley, Mike is here. Berkeley, for example, has really interesting ecosystem where many of the computer science architects have started putting things together which have been helping at least building infrastructure for doing machine learning statistics at scale. How does one, and that's just an example.
Mm-hmm.
How does sort of one bring that in our statistics community here?
That's a great question. So, I think there are a few ways to interpret your question. So I'll take one route, and then I'm sure other people will have other routes. You can look at some of the great work done at Berkeley where people are, building tools to make big-scale machine learning more usable, right? And I think we here have a similar question, which is, how exactly do we make statistical thinking usable across disciplines, right? That's not such an easy thing that, ties back in with Martin's point that maybe one of the most important things about statistics is really the tradition and the history of what statistical thinking means. It seems like, part of it is about, how exactly we can instill this kind of culture in the next generation of students. Because I think we've all seen this, that, you can realize that in your field you have a bunch of data and you can throw it into TensorFlow and get some results. But somehow later on you need to start to think about how can I think critically about my data? How can I get more out of it? How can I leverage insights that I bring in scientifically as a scientist and build them into my model? So personally, when we created this new major at MIT 6.4, the Artificial Intelligence and Decision-Making major, there was some really wonderful discussions as a part of that process. And there were a lot of pipelines that were drawn about what machine learning is. And I think that at MIT and in a lot of places, there's an emphasis on really the middle parts of that pipeline, about building systems, about computation, about running the thing. But really, it's at the endpoints where I think IDSS and SDSC have a lot of perspectives to contribute, which is how do you even formalize the problem to begin with? I remember, certainly when Philippe and I participated in Broad and math discussions, this was a big part of it, was biologists would teach us about biological problems, but we'd have to understand what are the different ways you could formalize the problem. And that's something which you very much need statistical and computation thinking. But at the other end of the pipeline, when you start to think about not just I improve the state of the art in predictions, but what do these predictions mean and what's the societal impact, this is also something that IDSS is very designed to solve. Things like the initiative on systemic racism or connections to synthetic controls, where we can bring in people who have more expertise in understanding the impacts and connect it to the rest of the pipeline. But I'd be curious if other people have other comments about Devrat's question too.
Well, maybe I have a question. It's sort of well, any politician knows that. I mean, is your question like I think this sort of integration of like large-scale computing and databases and so on, that's gone on, particularly at Berkeley. That's wonderful, of course, and it's wonderful to have that at MIT. But are you proposing that within IDSS per se that kind of connection would be interesting or valuable, or you're making an observation about the institute more widely?
So I think maybe I'm sort of broadly interpreting. Given that I don't wear any official hat at IDSS, I can interpret IDSS as
Devrat, do you want to use the mic?
Oh, I see. This is the last question I'll ask, because I think others should ask questions. But since I'm not wearing any official hat at IDSS, I will reinterpret IDSS's mission. Okay, and I think personally for me, as Alberto was narrating early on in his presentation, is that it provided a forum, a venue, a place to learn from each other from osmosis. Okay. I think in a similar manner, Ankur, as you pointed out, IDSS has great things to offer maybe at the two ends, and there's a middle. To make things successful, let's say, broadly speaking in the world, you need everything. So maybe from osmosis perspective, we're missing that middle layer here. Again, it doesn't mean that sort of that's what IDSS in my mind is more of an ether than a sort of a one place. And so how do we bring sort of that ether more broadly to that middle layer, as you said? Because going back to your point is that sort of, asking the right question and doing the right interpretation to the answer also means that you want to figure out what is the right way to do that when you're faced with a large amount of, let's say, in your example context, biological data. Okay. Or sort of, as Alberto pointed out, even sort of once he started doing computation for optimizing for synthetic control, that needs to be sort of something that needs to come. And again, absolutely right, just throwing TensorFlow is not the best thing. So then let's try to understand what is the best thing and how do we sort of have that conversation more broadly.
So I think something like what Berkeley does, where they build great systems for, say, basic machine learning tasks, and you can apply it everywhere, is great. But I think maybe a place like IDSS, the value add could be building the same kind of large-scale, high-quality open source software, but for things like running, for analyzing the US Census or for survey data. And so then, and good open source software that helps you analyze survey data, because that's something that a place like IDSS would have the value, and building open source software would crystallize what actually is needed by society versus us abstracting everything away and just dealing with the mathematically interesting part. Or building good experimentation platforms that help us run these A/B tests that we want to run, or allow anyone to run A/B tests and that'll give you interpretable answers. So maybe it's building open source software less for the foundational ML models, but maybe more for specific applications that show up everywhere, like surveys or A/B tests or things of that sort. That could be one way. Yeah.
I feel like it's controversy time, so I'll take the mic again.
Can we cut his mic? No?
So, I mean, I understand what you're saying, right? There is a piece of the puzzle for, translation, basically, to, say, public domain that's kind of missing. And the question is really, should it be there? So I'm not a software specialist, and, actually it's something that, developing software is something that actually personally scares me, because I feel like software is changing so fast that by the time you output our package, people will have moved to the end of the alphabet, right? And so, software is changing extremely fast, and, my colleagues doing Julia or Python probably will disagree, and they think that those are the things that we should actually develop. But it's also, there's two things. So, in my practical interaction with the Broad, it was great because I plugged in really higher up. I said, let's do optimal transport. 3 weeks later, everything was just like coded in and like run into production. So clearly they figured it out, how to do this. However, my impression is that the Broad is not releasing, day-to-day software, right? I think, it's a question to ask. Is it the role of MIT to have like all the nuts and bolts like done for software that's like super robust that you can actually release, or are we in the business of prototyping and then having maybe some companies or some dedicated entities that actually really translate that for general public? And so that's really the question, right? Are we supposed to prototype, or are we supposed to run like software that's just like completely deployed in the real world? Well, just ask this panel to computer scientists. Ask this question to a panel of computer scientists.
I'd love to fight with Philippe Rigollet. It's one of my favorite things. So I just totally disagree. I mean, at Berkeley, what happened is we infected a couple of the very strong systems people, Jan Stoika in particular, Scott Schenker, infected them with the idea that you need to be able to do things like bootstrap at scale, or online learning, or, blah, blah, blah. More statistical sorts of things, not just let's do TensorFlow better. That became Databricks, and became Ray, and became Anyscale. That's the most widely used software in the world. And you could have never given that to a company and have the company develop that. The only reason it's widely used in the world is because it's not a company. Okay? No one wants to buy into buying software from companies. They want to buy software from people who are doing it for other reasons, in particular academics. I was shocked to see this 10 years ago. I thought, the companies were going to give us all this, IBM was going to do machine learning, and so on. They did it, and no one bought it. And Databricks, became the leading, software platform for data science. And I just grab a couple of your systems colleagues here, and tell them, hey, what abstractions are you guys working on to do this for the real world problems? Hey, our kind of way of thinking would tie to that, and then and build that in. I think it would be a big mistake to think that we should abdicate to the companies to do these kind of things.
I mean, we can abdicate to Berkeley.
Yeah, right, sure. Can I try another? Can I try another take on his question?
Please.
So to me, Sandy Pentland, and I'm in IDSS as well as other things. To me, the interesting thing, it's wonderful to do Databricks. That's amazing. We don't have to do that. But we do have to mess around with real data because, for instance, when I do things, I often wander into data for which there isn't much statistical theory, right? They're extreme distributions of some sort. They're unstationary in weird ways. They've got all sorts of things that basically don't fit the well-developed models. And it's the feedback from running into these places where you can't really do a good job that's important. And the only way that I know to do that is to get out and play with real-world data. Now, it doesn't mean like you do it through a company. You do it, by getting involved in NGOs or the government or whoever has data. You go out and you try to solve some real problems, or maybe get some insights about those real problems, but pay attention to what are the things where your theory isn't strong enough. And I know among the people that I talk to in IDSS, that's seen as being the major weakness. Just saying. Okay.
Sorry, could you elaborate a little bit more? So the main weakness is developing
lack
more.
of interaction with real-world applications where you can learn about what are the statistical problems that really need to be solved where the theory isn't adequate yet, right?
I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the things that I find myself wondering about is, at least as a theorist, we think about all the problems that we could solve. And then when we have algorithms which might or might not be practical, we have a problem of how exactly do we go about trying these out? How do we find the right partnerships with people who know the right data sets to work with, which we can learn from? And I think one of the challenges is so much exciting stuff is happening in industry. Some of that is behind very proprietary, is behind closed doors. So to a certain extent, the availability of data sets biases which kinds of questions we might want to work on. So maybe one question of the panel is, what can IDSS and SDSC do to facilitate collaboration with people who have real-world data problems that they want to solve? Are there other directions that you would want to see people's research moving in, where you think there are exciting questions that people just haven't gotten around to thinking about yet?
I think that this is something that we have been discussing over the years, but like as you just said, many of the most exciting data sets, now they are in industry. They used to be kind of administrative data sets, or researchers used to collect those data sets by themselves, but now there may be industry data sets. There are a lot of privacy and security considerations, and individual researchers trying to deal with that, that is a huge bug, because you have to convince this particular company to release the data to you, under which security measures or security instruments are going to do that. And I think that creating standards for that and creating an environment in which is already down for someone who wants to have this kind of partnership with a a company there to use the data, that's something that will be very interesting direction to go more in that direction, because I think it's going to be important in the future. I think that answers a little bit of an answer to Debabra's question.
I think another thing we could do is, if you have a data set and you have a number you're trying to hit, it gets addictive for students, and you try to make algorithms and you keep playing with it till it gets better. But the data sets tend to generally be the ones that we use, like MNIST or what have you. And so there's more canonical data sets that maybe we could create at a place like MIT, where for more social applications where people get kind of addicted to making it, playing with it and getting better at it, like the Netflix problem that happened years ago, but the equivalent for something in the social sciences, I think would be one way to get people really plugged in and motivated to try new algorithms, make new algorithms, etc.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can comment that I think part of the strength of statistics is that at some level it's intellectually very broad. It spans part of mathematical science, but all the way to various applied domains. So I think it's important for us to sort of think of ways, both in our students, but more globally in the community, to facilitate this flow of ideas back and forth, because it's tremendously valuable. I mean, I think if you're interested purely in doing theory and you just sit in your office and sort of think of abstract problems all the time in statistics, I don't think that's the most effective way. I think if you go and you talk to people and you hear about new data sources, or you hear about settings in which standard methods break down for mysterious reasons, these kinds of dialogues lead to sort of interesting theoretical problems and can have practical impact. I think vice versa, application domain people going to methodological talks and educating themselves more broadly, this kind of two-way dialogue is what we need. So thinking about mechanisms to encourage and foster this, I think it's quite clear how you can do that locally within your own research group, but I think institutionally to think about it more broadly is a challenge, but worth thinking about.
Maybe one last comment on this. I think one venue that provides this flow of information between theory and applications is the IDPS program, the program where students enroll from their respective departments. And we do see a lot of people coming with data, say from brain cognitive sciences or from physics, doing applications that are outside of our scope, the people who are at the core of the IDPS. And I think that's a vehicle that can be explored more through presentations, through mini symposia and so forth, so that we get more exposed to these different type of questions. So that one thought.
Let me add one other comment before, and then Pekko can chime in. But I think one of the things which is important to keep in mind is that IDSS runs on people deciding to spend their time there, right? So it's not something that has it doesn't function the same way that a normal department is. When I look around this panel, I see a large number of people who chose to spend their time there because they brought in things that they cared about, and they realized that there was a connection to statistics, and then they brought in a lot of new agendas when they came with them. So partially, it's also about we have a huge amount of expertise around MIT's campus who they may not call themselves that, but they do an awful lot of applied statistics. Folks like that can really help catalyze research in new directions. So partially, there's a community aspect of how exactly do we build the right place for these people to want to come in and spend time and share their problems with us. Because I think all of us here are very open-minded. We came here because we have problems, we like hearing about other people's problems, and we want cool things to work on. And I think maybe that's a good segue to Pekko, who's a great example of someone who came in and spends a lot of time with us, and we're really glad she's here.
Wow, that's the best intro to a question I've ever gotten. Thanks, Ankur. So first, perfect segue to my question, actually. Am I allowed to require an answer from everyone on the panel for my question?
No, just Philippe.
Okay, I'm going to request an answer from everyone on the panel to this question. So I want to build off of some of the things I heard in Michael Jordan's talk this morning, where he had this vision of a new emerging discipline, right? So a new emerging discipline that we don't currently have sort of disciplinary structures for in the Institute. And what I've heard on this panel is a lot of talk about people who are anchored in classical disciplines and are doing a lot of interconnected, reaching out across those disciplinary boundaries and building a network. So like Ankur said, if we're thinking about IDSS as a place, what this is going to look like moving forward, the structures that you put in place may be different if you're building a new discipline versus enabling people anchored in classical disciplines to reach across those boundaries. So my question to you is a personal question that says, are you happier thinking about yourself as someone in an emerging new discipline, or someone who is anchored in a classical discipline reaching across those boundaries? And I'd like an answer from everyone on the panel if I can require it.
Well, I can begin, so I'm off the hook.
Sarah's required me to give an answer as well, but I'll go after you guys.
So I guess my answer would be I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy here. I very much sympathize with Mike's broader view that there is sort of a new discipline. I don't know what to call it. Like, I agree cybernetics is not going to catch on, but certainly captures a large part of what we're seeing. But it's not like this new discipline exists or will come into existence independently of what intellectual history we have. So I don't think the framing of sort of either or is the correct one. I sort of detected part of your concern in your question is something that I share, that if you have people that are very tightly anchored to their classical disciplines and there's some loose connections established, that's not so exciting. I don't think that's what we should head for. But at the same time, I don't subscribe to sort of modern hype that you have new disciplines or new this that sort of exist independently of existing knowledge. So I think the challenge here, something I said before, how do we build on the incredible intellectual strengths in statistics, in theoretical computer science, in policy, all these areas, how do we build them but integrate them in a way that's forward-looking? I don't have the answers to that, but I think that is sort of the central challenge of the next decade or so.
I'll answer too. So for me, it's definitely emerging. And the reason for that is, for a long time I thought of myself as a theoretical computer scientist, but honestly I find it very liberating to think of myself as working in an emerging area because there are no rules. You have a problem that's exciting to you. If you think of yourself as only a theoretical computer scientist, then maybe people would say, why are you working on this non-worst case model? I can because it's easier, because suddenly I see a route to attack the problem. So for me, there's I find it liberating in the sense that it allows me to explore a lot of other directions But at the same time, there's definitely a huge amount of truth in what Martin said, is that, even if you see yourself as working more in an emerging area, you should have an idea of what's the the bags you're bringing with you, right? Because you come with a particular perspective of how you're educated, about what types of problems for which that perspective is valuable for. And somehow it's your North Star, because, it teaches you at least how to attack a very complicated problem. So for me, one of the things which certainly gels things together is when I have students, when we work on a problem and it's a very complicated, real world problem that we think is important, as a theoretical computer scientist, the tradition is really boil it down to the simplest, most embarrassing problem you still can't solve. And that's the way we attack it. And regardless of which discipline I'm working in, that's still always my mentality.
So I'm going to, I don't know if I'm going to fall squarely into a camp here, and if there are camps. IDSS has been here around 10 years, and I think in this short amount of time, we've actually already built some sort of a foundation for what this emerging science actually is, I think. And in a way, it's been great to be nimble, to not have to copy what existed for centuries in classical statistics departments, and we've sort of created this organic. Look at this panel, right? We really come from different backgrounds, but we know each other very well, and we can probably have a fairly deep conversation together. But I think at the core of this is this, core set of tools that people know, and we're creating this culture, and this is, I think this emerging field that you're describing is actually built on this foundation and is growing in more direction, right? We have the nucleus, and now there's many directions in which we can grow, and I think really it's not a matter of growing, which will happen, it's a matter of what are the priorities, right? As the surface of this nucleus becomes bigger, we cannot grow in all directions at once, and Devarat mentioned some directions, and Sandy mentioned other directions, and I think it's going to be a matter of prioritizing, and we should keep it, I think, as ballish shaped as possible, rather than having something that becomes a stick pointing in one specific direction. But in many ways, I think the intellectual curiosity is really what links us together. Many of us are statisticians, not in statistics departments, and I think we are looking for this interface, and we're young, and it's not clear where we're going, but I think we are creating something, and I don't know if we have to define it. Maybe this is some administrative urge that we should succumb to define what it is, this new field that we're doing, and use a bunch of triangles to do this. But maybe we don't. Maybe we can just see what's going to happen. Oh, I had a triangle, right? My talk started with.
Sorry, our
math,
panel time
stats,
is unfortunately almost over. I'm sure Pekka is going to get the rest of her answers to her questions on the break. So if you haven't answered it, she will hunt you down. Let's take one last question from Ali, and then we'll take one short answer, and we'll continue the discussion at break.
Great. Ali Jadbabai, IDSS and Civil and Environmental Engineering. I guess my question is, when we started this with Munzer and others, we thought of the way to create this discipline was to create an academic program on social and engineering systems to train people in math of information sciences, a domain, and to have them go in depth in a social science. For the statistics side of thing, how do you see the best way moving forward? Do you think a standard statistics curriculum, like the way great statistics department at Berkeley or Stanford have it, is the right way to go? Do you think the IDPS framework that we have is the right thing? Or do you think we need an analog of SES that can go from social to societal? Just curious to hear your thoughts.
Oh boy, I think we're out of time for the panel. I think more seriously, it's really about building a community. And I think that I'm amazed at what kind of influence the type of research that's happened over the last few years has had on the statistics community at large. I think the next phase for SDSC, in my view, is building an institutional place for statistics to have its home at MIT. And that can mean a lot of things. That can mean, starting off by developing a graduate sequence in statistics. We have a lot of great progress sitting at the end of the table who's working on this, right? And this is really a place for people who, in their own research, they see a need for statistical tools to come and meet each other and to influence each other. that's the next phase. After that, maybe we should start thinking about having a statistics PhD program. We should think about, what are the administrative and institutional barriers that prevent people from collaborating across disciplines? And let's try and figure out what are mechanisms to get around these barriers. I think we have a long road ahead of us, but at least we have, some idea of what are the directions to move in next, and we have a lot of energy and excitement, so I'm very optimistic about what we're going to do.
Thank you.
So let's conclude the panel there before people ask me more administrative questions. Thank you all very much for your attention, and see you at lunch.